So the Texas suppressor lawsuit, which seeks to stop the NFA and ATF regulation of suppressors, is now being argued. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think the NFA and GCA need to be done away with, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Sonoran Desert Institute. SDI is an accredited online college that helps students learn these skills and techniques they will need to be successful in the firearms industry. So if you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, and learning about firearms, SDI might be a good option for you. To find out more about SDI, you can visit them using the website link down below. And thank you again to SDI for sponsoring this video. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we will be discussing the Texas Suppressor Freedom lawsuit, which aims to eliminate the NFA and ATF regulation of made in Texas suppressors. The case we will be discussing in this video is called Paxton v. Dettelbach. In this case, the state of Texas has now presented its arguments to the court about why these made in Texas suppressors should not fall under the NFA and also why the court should grant their motion for summary judgment. Now, for those not aware, this lawsuit arises out of Texas House Bill 957. HB 957 aimed to exempt from federal regulation all suppressors that are made in Texas and remain in Texas. HB 957 exempted silencers which are manufactured in Texas and which remain in Texas from federal laws and regulations, including the federal registration requirements and the taxation requirements under the NFA. After Texas passed this law last year, the ATF sent out a letter essentially threatening that they will in fact enforce the NFA and GCA's regulations against the made in Texas suppressors, and that they will enforce it against anyone who buys or sells these items. After the ATF sent out that warning letter, Texas and the Attorney General there, Ken Paxton, filed a lawsuit on behalf of individual Texas plaintiffs against the ATF. In the original complaint, the state of Texas argued that the federal regulation of these items that are made and stay within the state of Texas is not permitted since this law does not impact interstate commerce. They also argued that the federal regulation of these items by the ATF drastically impacts Second Amendment rights and also allows for an impermissible tax on a constitutional right. Then the state of Texas filed a second amended complaint, and this amended complaint added in strong Second Amendment arguments because of the Supreme Court's recent ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Under the Bruin framework, the state of Texas is arguing that the ATF cannot prove that their regulation of made in Texas suppressors has any basis in history or tradition of our nation and has no basis, no evidence dating back to 1791. In response to that, the ATF then tried their hand at a motion to dismiss, which was ultimately denied by the court. In that motion to dismiss, the ATF argued that the Second Amendment is not implicated in this case at all because they argue that suppressors are not bearable arms and therefore are not protected from regulation at all. The ATF made that type of claim in an attempt to avoid the obligation, which is outlined under the Bruin decision. As you can see, when it's convenient for the ATF, they argue suppressors aren't firearms or bearable arms protected by the Second Amendment, and therefore Bruin doesn't apply. But when it comes time for them to actually regulate these items, the very thing at issue in this case, they then all of a sudden will claim, in fact, these are firearms. However, the court ultimately in this case did not buy those arguments, so the court denied their motion to dismiss. Now, currently, the court has set this case to be heard on a summary judgment motion. In simplest terms, a summary judgment motion can resolve this dispute, decide the issue in this case, the legal issue in this case, without a full trial even taking place. And we just received the state of Texas's arguments for why the court in this case should in fact grant their motion for summary judgment, and ultimately why the court should find that made in Texas suppressors do not fall under the NFA's regulations, and therefore the ATF has no authority to regulate these items. In the brief, Texas argues, making a firearm suppressor for non-commercial personal use is conduct covered by the Second Amendment. Although the NFA itself defines firearm suppressors as firearms, whether a firearm suppressor is or is not an arm is not the issue. Firearm suppressors are attached to the barrel of firearms. When one keeps and bears arms with a firearm suppressor, one is exercising Second Amendment rights, just as one keeps and bears arms with a trigger or a detachable magazine or a scope, one is exercising Second Amendment rights. Regulating firearm suppressors, triggers, detachable magazines, or scopes is regulating conduct falling within the scope of the Second Amendment's guarantee. Likewise, when one goes to a firing range, they are exercising Second Amendment rights. even though a firing range is not an arm. In this section, Texas is combating the government's attempts to claim that suppressors are not bearable arms. Here, Texas argues even if the court finds a suppressor is not a bearable arm, the possession and use of those items is still conduct protected by the text of the Second Amendment. So really, it null and voids that argument being made by the ATF. Texas goes on to argue, moreover, in Bruin, the court defines arms broadly to include modern instruments that facilitate armed self-defense. Previously, it recognized the historical inclusion of armor of defense within the definition of arms, showing the definition is not limited to completed weapons. And Bruin clarifies that the Second Amendment covers conduct falling within the scope of the Second Amendment's guarantee, not just arms. So there, Texas is just pointing out multiple statements by the Supreme Court, which shows this opposition by the ATF that suppressors are not arms is essentially incorrect and really doesn't even provide them the type of protection which they believe it does in their arguments. Texas then points out in the brief that there is no historical tradition that supports this type of firearms regulation. They state, the first Congress enacted legislation commanding that every able-bodied male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45 be enrolled in the militia and equip himself with appropriate weaponry. Additionally, the 1792 Act required militia members to arm themselves rather than rely on the government to provide arms. State constitutions and statutes from the founding era also demonstrate a tradition of a permanent armed militia consisting of citizens keeping and bearing weapons in common use, withstanding armies during times of war only. Laws requiring militia service by people required to keep and bear commonly used arms is consistent with laws regulating and restricting making and possessing commonly used arms, such as firearms with a firearms suppressor attached. Defendants will not be able to overcome their burden. So the notion that the government now has the ability to regulate and prevent people from having commonly owned arms is just not consistent with our own nation's history and tradition. In fact, prior in the founding era, 1791, the government actually required people to maintain, to possess, and have these arms so that they could bring them for militia service. Texas then concludes by arguing, moreover, defendants are not able to establish a historical tradition of prohibiting the making of firearms unless pre-approved by the government. No government attempted to regulate the making of firearms until 1968, when the NFA was amended. Defendants are not able to establish a historical tradition of taxing the making of firearms. There were no American taxes on firearms in the 18th century. The first federal tax on firearms was enacted in 1919, and the first federal tax on making firearms was enacted in 1968. Finally, defendants are not able to establish an American 18th century historical tradition of requiring that firearms be registered or have serial numbers. Those requirements first appeared in 1934. In this section, Texas is pointing to the fact that the regulation of homemade firearms is a new restriction that did not pop up until the 1960s. Also, the concept of taxing and registering these items is also a fairly new concept that is not rooted in relevant history and tradition required by Bruin. For those reasons, Texas requests that the court grant their motion for summary judgment and find that the Made in Texas suppressor law is in fact valid and that the ATF has no authority to regulate Made in Texas suppressors. Now we will wait to see what the ATF's response is, and I suspect that they will try to bring forward some of the same arguments that they did on the motion to dismiss. It'll be interesting to see what the court ultimately decides to side with. So this is where it's currently standing for those of you who have been asking me about what's going on with the Made in Texas suppressor lawsuit. That's what's going on. If we get any more information, I will let you all know. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. As always, I want to thank everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, who shares these videos. You guys are directly impacting these videos, impacting this channel, and helping me to reach and educate more people than I could ever do on my own. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.